Welcome to the Curious Curate YouTube channel. I'm very excited to have our guest today, Dr. Seth Snyder. Dr. Snyder is a professor of dogmatics at the Reformed Episcopal Seminary and former professor of mine at RES, who played a big role in introducing me or getting me deeper into the classical Anglican tradition. And Dr. Snyder has a forthcoming book coming out on the doctrine of God, coming out later this year. And today we're going to discuss a article he wrote for the North American Anglican in 2023, which at the time caught a lot of people's attention, I guess is one way to put it. And I still think it's a very interesting proposal that's worth discussing. And that article is on the quest for a theological center in the Anglican tradition. I had a guest earlier, my first guest, Dr. Peter Robinson, said that Anglicanism is a tradition in search of a theological center, and I think that that's true. And so we're going to discuss that more in depth today. Dr. Snyder, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, why don't we we're going to talk about this article a little bit. It's about searching for an Anglican theological center. You mentioned how, there's kind of like some people have an anxiety about this lack of a center. There's a lot of diversity, a lot of theological diversity, a lot of room for different kind of expressions, but it lacks a center, which can be a little bit overwhelming. I'm just curious, in your own pilgrimage into Anglicanism, what moved you from identifying with a particular churchmanship to seeking a more coherent theological center? When did you kind of realize that that's something worth desiring in Anglicanism?
Yeah, well, the general principle that intelligibility and coherence is good, right? Yeah. It kind of led me in that direction. Although I have to preface this with this, my the central theological positions I put forward in the article are actually not my own. So in terms of, if you're asking the question, where did I stumble upon this particular mode of churchmanship that I'm presenting as what might be a good center for Anglicanism, it's actually not mine.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's worth pointing out. But as far as my own churchmanship, which I identify sort of as a moderate Laudian or old High Churchman, I was drawn to that because of my close reading of the Church Fathers. I actually came into Anglicanism having been already a close reader of the Church Fathers as a classicist. So I was studying classics and encountered the patristic tradition. Really just fell in love with it. So I think the old High Church position, maybe eking towards the prayer book Catholic position, sort of your lower moderate Anglo-Catholic position. That's kind of where I land as the most faithful to the broad patristic tradition.
Interesting. I did not realize that your proposal is actually not necessarily your churchmanship. So that's fascinating. Okay, well, we'll get into that more. What a humble kind of thing to be presenting then to the province.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, was there a particular turning point, I guess? Did you have a moment of dissatisfaction or something that were, in the theological landscape, particularly in the province, which kind of spurred you on to write this, I guess? How would you assess the landscape currently and its lack of center?
I didn't have a turning point where I found the diversity and the diversity within the Anglican tradition troubling myself, but it seemed that a lot of other people did. So I felt that it was pertinent to write about that. Having come from a classics background and reading the Church Fathers through that lens, which by the way, I don't know how many of your listeners read a lot of the Fathers, but it's a very diverse, very eclectic world, the ancient and early medieval church. There's a lot going on. There's nothing like the uniformity you'd find, either in the confessionalized Protestant churches or in the post-Tridentine Roman Church. That's a later development. So for me, Anglicanism diversity just kind of reinforces its being a reflection of the ancient and primitive church, right? You see that there, you see it within the church, within the Anglican Church now. But it seemed that a lot of people didn't like this. So I felt obliged to write on it. And it was, so yeah, the turning point for me was just seeing how frustrated people were, Anglicans in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find that too. I experienced it myself, and I think with a lot of people who are coming from evangelicalism or some other lower church tradition, they love the rootedness, but then they're we don't necessarily have a Westminster Confession or a Belgic Confession, and something as theologically sturdy. So there's other anchors that we appeal to. So I think this piece is really important. And speaking of which, I think when there's this anxiety or this feeling of overwhelm regarding this topic, sometimes these debates that happen all the time online can go awry or not be done correctly. I mean, this just seems like to be happening every day on X in the Anglican world. And you mentioned in your piece how Anglican debates should and should not proceed. So how should they? I guess we will get into how they should proceed. How should they not proceed? And what are some examples of ways that these debates have been done in an unhealthy manner?
Well, Paul talks about in Galatians, and of course, this is in the context of rebuking or correcting someone for, obvious sins. But I think it applies as well to how we should debate. Paul advises us to reproach one another meekly, gently, with charity, and I think that should spill over, into the way we argue theology with one another in the church. So I think, I think we should remember that we're not talking about what the evangelicals like to call salvation issues, or what in historic Protestantism would be called fundamentals. The subtle differences and the mechanics of Christ's presence in the supper between the Reformed and more Lutheran leaning Anglicans are not make you or break you doctrines. It's not to say they're not important either, but so keeping in mind we are insofar as we're holding to the Apostles' and Nicene Creed and the fundamentals of the faith, we're arguing with brothers and sisters in Christ, and we should do that in a spirit of charity and humility, and not we shouldn't do it from a place of pride. I have access to this special knowledge and you don't, so I'm teaching you. That posture is not helpful. An openness to being possibly wrong on the way one has thought about and framed their understanding of English, Anglican Church history and theology. I think that's helpful as well. A little epistemic humility, and I think first and foremost, remembering that as Anglicans, what we're ultimately trying to do within that mode of expression, trying to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. I don't think our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is at all glorified in us being petty and nasty with each other.
Yeah, and I appreciate that this piece, I think, is just also a pedagogical example of maybe how to go about debate, because you kind of establish that we need a method before we offer our conclusions, and so often we rush into our conclusions. So I kind of want to work through this method, or I guess it's a method, or some key things to keep in mind as one approaches if one wants to propose a theological center for Anglicanism or advocate for their churchmanship. I think it's helpful that you offer a method on how to do so. That I think creates guardrails that keeps one in check in terms of doing so with charity and not falling into the ditch of pettiness and things of that nature. So let's, I guess, get into that. And I guess this is kind of your classicist kind of procedural kind of instincts coming out in this piece. But you write that a theological center does not necessarily exclude other acceptable schools. Quote, a theological center does not, or at least should not, exclude other non-central theological schools and sensibilities within an acceptable range. I guess someone might hear that and think, if centering will make room for other camps that I vehemently disagree with, or I think are not conducive to Anglicanism, what does it actually accomplish? So if centering does not exclude, what does centering actually accomplish?
I think centering without excluding other camps or church parties has the effect of basically putting our best foot forward and emphasizing certain facets of a given theological school over others. And I think the best way to illustrate how this can be done effectively is actually with reference to the Roman Church in the 19th century. So when some of the nastier, more pernicious aspects of modernity started peeking their heads out, the Roman Catholic Church wisely recognizing these aspects as having their origins in philosophical nominalism and Scotism. What the Roman Church began doing was emphasizing Thomism, which is something that's still going on in the Roman Church today, right? There's a civilizational crisis, a culture war, if you will, to use the language that people use now. And we have this pool of resources, and this is the best resource we have to deal with this problem. And so we're going to market that, right? We're going to, teach this at seminaries and in Catholic universities, and we're going to try and counter these nasty particulars of modernity with a robust philosophical Thomism. Molinism, Franciscanism, the Jesuits, they don't disappear, right? They're still there. But what the Roman Church in response to this issue was marketing and really putting forward and trying to develop and emphasize was Thomism. I think that's a good example. So just to sort of ostensibly define what I think we should do, that's what I'm looking at. This is sort of, given the times, given what's needed, this is, from our pool of resources, what we have that can treat this problem, without getting rid of the other things.
I think it's a helpful analogy. The centering of Thomas is kind of the center. And you mentioned in the piece that centering does not exclude, but it does end up weeding out certain more fringe ideas or camps. What might be an example of certain fringe camps that might end up being weeded out in a world where there is a pursuit of an Anglican theological center?
I think Trent-friendly Anglo-papalist would be a pretty obvious example. These would be those Anglicans that consider themselves part of Rome, even if it's not formally acknowledged, and reverence the very late and I think decadent medieval system that the English reformers, again, I think rightly rejected. That would be something I think you'd want to weed out, and that would be something that if on the high end you have, say like Pusey, and on the low end you have say Ryle, right? That's going out of that sphere. Conversely, if you have, and this is something we see more in the Church of England than we do in the United States, but those officially C of E churches that are indistinguishable from a charismatic non-denom church. That would be something that is, even J.C. Ryle and John Davenant and Charles Simeon would be like, oh, what is this,
Yep.
So yeah, there are certain things that I think you would want to weed out, and that having the center I've proposed, or some other similar center would effectively do.
Yeah, I think that's so I think that for someone who might listen and say, okay, that's just it still makes room for everybody. It does create still a spectrum, but and it does still weed out it would weed out potentially some more fringe views, but in a way that keeps everybody else within a certain spectrum included. And you talk about an exclusion and relativization. One of the things that Anglicanism lacks is this kind of through line of the dogmatic tradition. In some ways, you mentioned how the Lutheran Orthodox, there's this through line that you can kind of look at of theological continuity in terms of the field of dogmatics or systematics. The Presbyterians have the similar kind of, their theologians, their systematic dogmatic theologians. The Dutch Reformed have that. we kind of have guys that focus on certain specific areas, but we don't necessarily have that same cohesion. Um, but does this mean that anything goes when it comes to? Does this mean that it's just fully anything goes? I guess because some people will point to that reality and say, "See, so I can kind of build upon my own. I can we this is an evolving tradition, or anything goes. There's not one that outweighs the other." How would you respond to that in terms of pursuing a theological center?
Well, I think it's obvious that between absolute rigidity and anything goes, there's an enormous continuum. That's
Some people don't. Some people don't think that. So I know it seems silly, but I'd love for you to address it.
well, those people watch mature in their thinking, because there just is a whole, there's a huge space between those two extremes that we can go to. Um, yeah, and I think this is a mark of mature thinking in the gray, and in those immediate spaces. So, how would I respond to that? One, it's not anything goes. We're talking about an Anglican theological center. We're talking about Anglican distinctives. But when it comes to the Catholic faith, the faith put forward in the Apostles' Nicene and Athanasian Creed, that's standard across the board. If you're a snake belly low evangelical who denies, the truths of say the resurrection, right, or the full deity of the Son of God, or his consubstantiality with the Father, that's you're no longer Christian in a Catholic sense, right? That sort of thing. So we're all together there. It's not anything goes, absolutely speaking and broadly speaking. No, we're talking about a set of Anglican specifics here. So is it anything goes even there? Even then, I don't think so.
Yeah.
We have the rubrics. Not everyone follows them, but the rubrics are on the book. There
Yeah.
are established guidelines that we have. We could be much better at enforcing those, but they're definitely there. So it's not an anything goes. It's literally in the book. It's in the Book of Common Prayer. What we at a bare minimum have to do. You have the shall be done or the shall be read, and then you have the mays, right? That stuff's there in writing. So it's we do have some guidelines even with these Anglican particulars that we're required to follow, and for those who don't, they're just being disobedient to the tradition.
Yeah. And how do you respond? Why would you say that? How would this be a strength in terms of, all right, we don't have like, I would argue that Anglicanism doesn't have like its Herman Bobbink or its fill in
Yeah.
the blank.
Quenchstead, Turretin.
Yeah. Why? How is this? How's this actually potentially a strength for Anglican dogmatics and searching for a theological tradition? What would be for someone that says that's why I can't be Anglican? I need something like the Book of Concord. I need something like the Westminster Standards. For someone like that, what would you say as to how this is potentially a strength for Anglicanism? That okay, we have the formularies. They're not as specific, but they do give guardrails. We don't have these figures necessarily in terms of dogmatics, but why might that be a strength?
Yeah. Well, there's a good reason why that's strength. But first, I want to say, if you want some singularity, some singular clarity, some absolute precision, you're not even going to find that anymore in like the Lutheran and Presbyterian churches. Like you're going to have Presbyterians, for example, is sort of a model of Protestant clarity and precision, but you're going to find Federal Vision guys, Synod of Dort guys who hate the Synod of Dort, Bardians, all sorts of different things. Like if that's what you want, I'm just sorry. Like there's no denomination, with the exception of like the tiny, like 14 parish big, obscure, denominations, where you're going to find that. So sorry for your luck on that front. But why that's a strength is because any system of thought, theological, philosophical, or even scientific, the more complex and layered it is, the more resilient it is to attack, the more strong it is in debate. So, whereas the more rigid and systematized the thing is, it might be really tough, but when it falls hard. Let's take, for example, Euclid, right? Euclid, you have this, you have your five postulates, or your five common notions, your axioms, and all those sorts of things. and the whole system just flows from out of those, right? It's neat, it's tidy, it's deductive. There's no lack of clarity or precision to it. It's mathematically precise, right? But then when you discover, with the parallel postulate, the fifth postulate, that there's certain, there's spaces where that doesn't really apply, and then, then you get Lobachevskian and Riemannian geometry, and now Euclid's geometry is, it's not false in the strict sense, but I mean, it fell pretty hard, in the 19th century. Newton's mechanics was like this as well, right? You had a few fundamental laws, you have your corpuscles, your material bodies that they apply to, and the system sort of flows from out of that. But once you discover subatomic particles, like, the system crashes really hard. Now people study string theory and quantum mechanics, all that sort of thing. So, and the same thing happens in theological traditions. The Lutheran Orthodox, this happened in Lutheranism. The Lutheran Orthodox tradition was, especially with Quenstedt, who's sort of the capstone figure, following, like Chemnitz and Gerhard, right? He's the guy that sort of finishes the project. His dogmatics works were so rigorously precise, so systematic, and so well structured. But then, once the pietists come in, emphasizing the affective dimension of faith, and which Quenstedt isn't really equipped to deal with as well, like, the Lutheran Orthodox system sort of plummets, right? It falls really hard. So having something that's less rigorous and less systematic actually makes it more resilient. And I think that's one of Anglicanism's great strengths. Anglicanism just weathered the Enlightenment, higher criticism, all those things much better than those other more rigid traditions.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. That it kind of it gives it some strength in areas that one might not at first think. I guess my question too is in terms of exclusion and relativization. Do you think that the three streams model as currently presented of Catholic, evangelical, charismatic, as kind of the de facto model in the province, is that a proposal for a theological center? Like, do you think there is a theological center hit in that proposal, or do you think that's just kind of like more relativism, like let's agree to disagree, and these three camps just coexist? How do you assess that in terms of this conversation about centering?
I think the three streams, I mean, without absolutizing them, right? It's not like you have,
Sure.
in the way that you'd have like a Roman Catholic parish that's headed by Dominicans or Franciscans, right? It's not formally cut off from one another. But I think it's descriptively correct. It's what you find when you go to an ACNA parish. You're going to find one of those three emphases usually. So, whether that's normatively the way to go is a different question. I think it's descriptively right.
Yeah.
Is it relativism when it comes to Anglican identity and Anglican distinctives? I'd say no. There are precedents for all three of those sub traditions within the broader classic Anglican tradition. With the possible exception of the charismatic tradition. The charismatic strand is, largely a product of the late 19th and 20th centuries. But even then, there's an argument to be made. I mean, in the Anglican tradition, you see this in William Forbes, you see it in Richard Fields. They're not principled cessationists in the way that you get like with the Reformed, right? So there's at least, and even in the Book of Common Prayer, say in the rite for visitation of the sick, there's sort of an opening, or rather an openness to the miraculous. But we're not Pentecostals. We're not trying to make it happen, right? But there is this openness to the supernatural and the charismatic that I think might not naturally lead to, but does create the space for the charismatic branch. So, and then of course with the classic Anglican emphasis on patristics, seems to connect with the Tractarian movement and Anglo-Catholicism, right? They're the Tractarians, the Anglo-Catholics just kind of emphasize different aspects of the patristic tradition than did say Ussher and Davenant and Parker. And then with the Evangelicals, Cranmer's religion of the heart is sort of the source for that. emphasis of Cranmer's never fully dies out. It sort of comes out in full force in evangelicalism. So all of them have their origins in the classic tradition. So it's not merely relative. It's not like we're just doing this. No, they're harkening back to something that's there and just kind of putting it up front is
Sure.
what's going on, and relegating other things to the background, which can be problematic in
Yeah.
some ways. But
So it is in some
not
ways.
arbitrary.
It is in some ways a center, like the current theological center. I mean, because in some ways it does push other views out in the periphery.
Yeah, it does.
I think that's interesting.
It becomes a bad thing when it's trying to push out things that also and at the same time belong to the classic tradition.
I think that this is kind of like a realization for me right now. I think that's kind of where I hadn't realized, like, the old high church tradition or the central churchmanship position is on the periphery in this framing, and it's a product of kind of what's being centralized. So I think that's interesting. And speaking of kind of moving to your next section about picking and choosing, someone's going to hear centering as a project. I think some people, and I think I lean towards this, I want to say that there just is an objective Anglican center. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's maybe more where I lean. But I appreciate what you write. You mentioned how at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, we're all picking and choosing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess some people might want to say, okay, so if your proposal is merely picking and choosing, how is that not subjective? What are the guardrails and the standards within picking and choosing? Is this just like, I'm picking and choosing these things, which we'll talk about what you pick and choose, but someone else can pick and choose something with an entirely different emphasis that would make Anglicanism look very different? Are both right in a project of desiring a theological center?
It depends on the standards they're using to determine what a good center is. So I guess it is inevitably subjective in the sense that you have, intentional deliberating subjects making theological decisions, right?
Sure.
It is integrally and essentially a subjective project. But in the sense that subjective is used in common language as arbitrary, no, I don't think so. You need a set of principles and guidelines, a particular historiography of the Anglican Church in order to make these sorts of decisions. But so it might be subjective in one sense, but it's not therefore arbitrary. There are guidelines, and the formularies I think are a good one. The patristic tradition, what is it Lancelot Andrews says? One Bible, 2 testaments, three creeds, 4 councils, 5 centuries. You do have these standards and places that you can point to and appeal to in arguing for a particular center. So I don't think it's merely relative. There's certainly subjective elements, and what one emphasizes and tries to exclude are going to be somewhat relative to their theological temperaments and sensibilities. But it's far from arbitrary. There's a lot of moving parts and for Anglicans, a lot of different standards that we appeal to in trying to do this sort of thing.
Yeah, I find this tension of, like, I want to say, like, there is a Platonic form of Anglicanism that exists out there, but then at the same time, if I'm honest, I do a little picking and choosing. Like, okay, I like the old High Churchmen, but I like something that Pusey says here, or I like something that Ryle says here, and I am doing that instinctively, and I actually am centering and picking and choosing. So as much as I think there's the two wolves within me of there's a Platonic form, and you need to fight for this, but there is this beauty. There is this potential for this beautiful tradition that is unfolding, and there are these moments that have a place. And I think properly centering an Anglican tradition allows room for the Oxford movement and taking the best of that, allows room for the evangelical revival, and even allows room for the emphasis on the charismatic or the mystical element. So, I think at the same time, when people want to just hunker down and say there is this one perfect Anglicanism, which is where I lean all the time.
I'm highly critical of I understand the impulse, but I'm critical of the Platonizing.
Yeah, totally.
Taxonomy. I think the better guy to go to is Wittgenstein. We don't have. I think with Anglicanism, I think in general, with these big, civilizational, theological, philosophical phenomena, we we don't have like this neat and tidy set of necessary and sufficient conditions, this Platonic form of whatever it is that we're talking about. I think what you get are family resemblances. Are you familiar with that? Or would our listeners be familiar with that?
Maybe unpack that a little bit for our listeners.
Okay, so if rather than having a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, these are the properties that are necessary to be classed as this sort of thing. Here's the properties that are sufficient to be classed as this sort of thing. Rather, what you have are a set of overlapping properties that are similar to, and this is where Wittgenstein gets the name, families. So Snyders are generally rather stocky and hairy guys. Snyder men are. But I have a cousin, shall remain unnamed because we're on YouTube, who's not quite as stocky, but he's quite hairy, and he has the light skin, and he has the the eye color, right? He has those features. But then there are other Snyders that are stocky and hairy, but have different eye colors, right? So you have all these varying properties, none of which hold for every member of the class, but there's they're common within that class. So that's a family resemblance relation in that way to taxonomize things and categorize things. I think that's the best way to do this with Anglicanism too.
I think you need to write a piece about that model of Anglicanism. Seriously. Well, if we don't, this piece that we're discussing comes from the North American Anglican. So just wanted to say a little bit about the North American Anglican briefly, and then we'll continue on our interview. So this piece first appeared at the North American Anglican. It's an online journal devoted to Orthodox Anglican theology and the renewal of classical Anglican thought. And I'm grateful for my strategic partnership with them, for their ongoing contribution to serious theological discourse within the Anglican tradition. The North American Anglican publishes substantive essays on Scripture, the 39 Articles, church history, moral theology, and many other pieces like what we're discussing right now, and the pressing issues facing the church today. Their contributors include clergy and scholars from across the Anglican world, including several more articles by Dr. Snyder. If you value thoughtful, rigorous engagement with Anglican formularies and the Catholic tradition, I highly encourage you to explore their work. You can see a link for this specific article in my description for this video, and just a general link for their general website, and look into their social media as well. They're a great resource. I seriously recommend them. I'm sure you agree, Dr. Snyder.
Oh yeah, North American Anglicans.
Two cheers for the North American Anglican.
Oh yeah.
Great. Well, let's continue on. I think that's but that model of a family, I think that could be a really helpful model to flesh out for people.
I might write on that. Yeah, it might be worth doing.
Yeah. So you talk about a church under authority. This is something else that we have to consider, and I really appreciate this piece because I think, especially when people are coming from more low church context, they don't have this awareness, including myself, of church authority, the binding nature of canons and constitutions, and ecclesial law. I mean, you teach on Hooker, and I think that's something that you have to, a language that is foreign from certain contexts. Like, okay, your local church has bylaws, but this is a whole province and things of that nature. So you argue that a North American Anglican center must conform to the canons and constitutions of the church. So if one is in the ACNA, there's canons and constitutions, but that also includes subscription to the 39 Articles in their literal and grammatical sense. Province's founding, it's one of its founding principles that you need to subscribe to 39 Articles and it brings back the 39 Articles from a historical document, which tended to kind of be the view in the 20th century, back into the forefront now as no, this is a binding doctrinal statement that can't be track 90'd. It needs to be read in its literal and grammatical context. And I think that reframes the conversation in so many ways. Why is submission to the church's constitutional and canonical framework essential for your vision of a theological center?
Well, if you can't enforce the center, why have it at all? Authority needs to be acknowledged in order for.
You're saying that loud people on Twitter is not enough?
That's as much good and as they do, and as helpful as all that is. Loud people on Twitter are not enough. No, you need the exercise of episcopal authority, and doctrinal standards. Yeah, if you don't have that, and we do, or if you're not enforcing it, and we don't seem to be doing that well, then a center is a center in name only. It has to have some teeth. That's
Yeah.
it.
Here's a question I do have, though. You describe Anglicanism as conciliar, and I think that's fascinating because I don't know all these. I don't conceive of conciliarism with Anglicanism necessarily. Maybe that's because of just the global nature of Anglicanism and its lack of institutional unity, like Rome does. But what do you mean by conciliarism, particularly in the Anglican tradition, particularly for North American Anglicanism?
So conciliarism, the term has to do with councils, right? So there's a body of authorities that gather together at a council and make whether it's dogmatic or canonical pronouncements. So that's all that means etymologically. But as far as Anglicanism being a conciliar church, we do meet a council. The college of bishops here recently met at council in order to address some of the issues that we were alluded to but did not expound on earlier, things like that. So that's definitely there. And the Anglican Church has always been that. When it's promulgated the Acts of Uniformity in the 16th century, or at the Restoration in the 1660s, and the reformulation of the Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 version, all that stuff required a gathering of bishops meeting in council together, deliberating, praying, thinking together about these things, and issuing at the end of that an authoritative statement on this or that doctrine, or this or that document, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And Anglicanism does just this. We're not Congregationalists. We have bishops representing different, geographical and even non-geographical dioceses who get together and ask these tough questions. We do that well. We've done that, for example, on the women's ordination thing. We put together a task force, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that. We're doing that effectively. It's the enforcement,
Right.
where the issue comes to play.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it just seems with the ACNA being kind of relatively new, in terms of theological, conciliarism around theological topics. Seems like, okay, there was that commission on holy orders back in 2017, and we haven't seen. And then there was maybe one on sexuality that an official
I think
statement
it
was
was quite good. I think both of those were quite good.
and they were very in depth, very impressive. I read the Commission on Holy Orders last summer,
Yeah.
and I guess it'd be good to see more of that of theological kind of inquiry as a institution. I think that's what I admire a lot about the PCA and the Presbyterian polity. Is like they've kind of have that as a well worked machine of figuring out theological issues that are relevant. In terms of conciliarism, I guess this is one might have a concern here. Like, how do we discern? Like, wasn't the Episcopal Church, wasn't that just conciliarism in terms of its agreements on evolving on certain matters? Where can conciliarism become something else? I guess because there's agreement does not necessarily mean that it's, I guess, correct. So how do you respond, or how do you interpret, how do we view conciliarism in light of something like because that was conciliar, I guess, the agreements in the Episcopal Church, relatively speaking. So how would you respond to that?
To paraphrase and use the article, as the churches at Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome hath erred, so doth the Episcopal Church err, even in matters put forward by a council. Councils aren't infallible, safeguard. Just as humans can err individually, fallen humans can err corporately, and that's what happened at Tech. So it's conciliarism is a good thing, but it's not, and it's a thing that Anglicans do. But like Anglicans have always held, we're the cosmos and human beings in particular are quite damaged, and this can go wrong. This can go poorly. So I think it's as simple as that. That's an instance where the bishops of the Episcopal Church had been overtaken by certain cultural trends and the zeitgeist, and trying to be on the right side of history, they were on the wrong side of the gospel. And effectively codified those errors in a conciliar manner.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's helpful too. So, that's one piece of the greater, the greater, it's not just the conciliar, but there's other
I do want to emphasize the importance of the conciliar character of the church. While it is infallible, it's good.
yeah.
Exercise and moderate diet aren't going to guarantee that you don't get a heart attack, but they're certainly going to be conducive to you not getting a heart attack. You're not going to put those things away because they're not going to infallibly preclude you getting a heart attack. You do those things. You have those safeguards in place, those practices in place, and you pray for the best.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's we're not individual entities. If we're confirmed and members of an Anglican church or part of a parish, a diocese,
For all of its failings,
the province, and for all its failings, but for all its all that it does, all the good it does. So that's the messy but good nature of it. Speaking of messiness, you talk about ecumenism. um, Ecumenism in the trenches. You write, when deciding which features of our tradition to elevate, which ones to moderate, and which ones to exclude, it is important that we think about the ramifications these decisions might have on our ecumenical dialogue.
Mhm.
Are there any positions that you have in mind when you're writing this, or like what would be? I guess two questions. My first question is this, because I think this impacts what doctrines we emphasize. When you're talking about ecumenism, I think that there's two poles of ecumenism. Like, okay, like there's the greater Protestant world that we can try to unite with, but there's also the apostolic traditions of Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and it seems like which pole do you more lean towards, or when you're talking about ecumenism? Because it seems like there's two different directions that the shape of the theological center might take, depending on which pole you're trying to have unity with.
Yeah. Depends on the time period. So in the
Sure.
in the Victorian era, for example, we read Alexander Penrose Forbes' commentary on the Articles when you were in that. We did read that when you were in class.
Yes,
right?
we did.
And he seems really concerned about those more pernicious aspects of the modern tradition, and is concerned about countering those. And so for him, an alliance with Rome was really important, right? Well,
Yeah.
Vatican II has happened, Francis has happened. The German bishops are enormously influential in the Roman Church. So like maybe that's no longer the case, right? Like we can no longer look to Rome as like a safe haven for conservatives to have a niche space where they can hold to their positions and push against modernity. No longer the case, right? The ecumenical landscape has changed. I think from a purely dogmatic standpoint, our closest ecumenical conversation partners, from my point of view, naturally would be conservative Lutherans, right? So LCMS, Wisconsin Synod, folks like that. Conservative Reformed, and conservative Methodist. So I incline more towards the traditional Protestants, because most of you can be pretty comfortably sort of like a moderate Reformed guy in Anglicanism, just like what you find in the PCA, but just accept bishops, right? Like with those groups, or with Lutherans, for example, you're the Tractarians and some of the non-jurors basically took on a more Lutheran understanding of the real presence. They took on a Arminian understanding of predestination, which is what you get in Lutheranism. So you could be that in the Anglican world. Just accept bishops, right? So I think given that the real obstacle towards reunification with other Protestants, that has more to do with episcopal polity than doctrine, that might be the easier hurdle, right?
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah.
with Rome, Rome is a house divided. Like, who in Rome are you talking to? The rad trads? Are you talking to the liberals? The moderate post Vatican II guys like Bishop Barron, Ultramontanus? Like it.
Sure.
Byzantine Rite Catholics. Who it's hard to tell.
Yeah.
So that's I'm not I'm not overly optimistic about our dialogue with the Roman Church, just because Rome is a house divided as
Yeah.
well. It's so what do you do with that? Orthodoxy, I actually am a little more optimistic about. So probably for me, the two conversation partners we should be looking at most closely would be, the Lutherans, High Church Reformed, and Eastern Orthodox.
What would you say to someone from another tradition listening to this and say, well, Anglicanism is a house divided. Why would we can't, why would we engage in conversations with them?
Because
I think that's the real reality, and there's solid people out there, but it's also at the same time while we're having this conversation, it is so diverse, and there's some pretty important issues that are unresolved. What would you say?
Well, rhetorically, some of these issues surrounding Anglican distinctives seem to get elevated to the status of dogma. The Anglican Church is agreed on the dogmas of the Church, on the Catholic faith, on the fundamentals. That's something worth celebrating.
Yeah.
Whereas Rome is having fights over fundamental issues by their standards, namely the place of the papacy, its orientation towards the modern world, things like that. Pretty fundamental issues that they accept as fundamental are up in the air. With them. So I don't think we're a house divided in the same way. We bicker and argue a lot, but I think most people, if they're in their cooler moments, when they're a little more level and thinking clearly, they can look at the Anglicans who they just berated on Facebook or whatever, and say, "Oh, that's an Apostles' Nicene Athanasian Creed accepting Trinitarian, Christian. Like, this is my brother, this is my sister." So that's we dogmatically we're not a house divided.
Sure.
We are liturgically, in some degree, sacramentally, which is not unimportant. It's very important. And when it comes to holy orders, we are somewhat divided, but we are all Catholics in the sense that we all accept the rule of faith and the faith held by handed down to the saints once for all.
I appreciate your optimistic, positive view there, because I think that we don't hear that enough. I think that I don't know. Yeah, I appreciate that truly, because I think people, the dogmatics is there, as you say. So I think that's really helpful. So turning maybe finally to your proposal, I love that you laid out all this groundwork before you get to your thoughts on this. And now we know that these thoughts aren't necessarily reflective of your own churchmanship fully. So I think that's interesting. But you propose kind of just three major areas that you have a proposal for centering: Eucharistic theology, and soteriology, and lastly, ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if there's any other kind of big areas you want to add to that, but let's get into the ones that you propose. So in Eucharistic theology, you propose that we center kind of more like an Anglo-Lutheran view, and I would love you to expand on that. What is that? What is just for our listeners? What is an Anglo-Lutheran view of the Eucharist? What would you say are its core markers, and what would then become peripheral, and then what would become excluded?
Yeah, so an Anglo-Lutheran view would be an Anglican view that approximates towards or is adjacent to the Lutheran doctrine of the sacramental union. So this would be the idea that Christ, what this looks like is an emphasis on the objectivity of Christ's presence in, with, and under the forms of bread and wine, which is not necessarily the mainstream historical view within Anglicanism, but becomes more prominent with non-jurors and has precursors arguably in the thought of Thorndike and William Forbes, and becomes pretty mainstream in the Tractarian and Anglo-Catholic movements. So an emphasis on the real, objective, substantial presence of Christ's body and blood in, with, and under the elements of bread and wine. Not corporeal presence. And your good Lutherans will tell you this. We don't mean the presence of Christ's natural or physical body and blood, but rather his spiritual body and blood. And they conceive of this sort of on the analogy of what an angelic body is, right? That's what a spiritual bodily presence is. It's
Yeah.
locatable, but it doesn't have mass. It's not extended in space, that sort of thing. So we're delving off to the metaphysics of angelology and things like that.
Sure.
So that's what that view looks like. So, and there, like I said, with Forbes, Thorndike, some of the other radical Laudians, and then later the non-jurors, Tractarians, and Anglo-Catholics, that's a predominant view. And I think the advantages of this is it's a robust sacramentality. It really emphasizes the that aspect of the church's tradition. It's what a lot of people come into Anglicanism for, right? They want that robust sacramentality. It's more easily understood, I think, than the nuanced Reform view, which, by the way, is my own view. Whether that's symbolic instrumentalist, virtualist, dynamic receptionist, what have you. It's just a much more straightforward, here is the body and blood of Christ, boom, sort of view. That an evangelical who isn't trained in Aristotelian metaphysics and early modern sacramental theology can take hold of and appreciate. So that's why that's effective. What would it would then sort of not sideline, but push away from the center what had been the historical position throughout most of the late 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries. The family of Reform views, virtualism, symbolic instrumentalism, what have you. So those would become, integral to the tradition, but not as central as they would have been in the classic period. And it might be a little bit more friendly to those Anglo-Catholics who like transubstantiation and try to meander around the articles to get there. And it would certainly exclude Zwinglianism. That's probably what that would look like.
Interesting. So this is I think is an example of, you're looking at the context today of what people are like. You're making this pick based on, this was a minority position at most, right? Would you say for the 16th through 18th century?
In the late 17th, early 18th century, it starts to become, say, a significant minority position. But yes, certainly minority position.
But you're looking at why people are coming into Anglicanism, and they're drawn to the Eucharist. They're drawn to the objectivity of the presence of Christ. And so you're saying, for the sake of the tradition going forward, for an ecumenical vision, for a contextual vision, and just like a 21st century vision, how would you respond to someone saying like, well, this is the debate from my understanding, the early Lutheran Reformed debates about this was, underlying this Eucharistic debate was a debate of Christology. I mean, how would you respond to someone who says it's not merely just the mode of Christ's presence? So we're talking about the mode of Christ's presence has to do with, Christ himself and how his glorified human body works. Do you think that, how do you think the deeper Christological implications of centering one view over another plays a role in this? Can we just say like, this is just Eucharistic theology, but the Christology is unaffected, or what would that do in terms of more of on a dogmatic level?
Well, you can say that, but it would be false. I mean, Christology and Eucharistic theology are integrally bound up. I don't think you need radical Lutheran ubiquitarianism, the idea that Christ's human body is ubiquitous in the manner of, an omnipresent God, a ubiquitous repletive presence, to get a real spiritual and substantial objective presence of Christ in the supper. I don't think you need that. So while they're connected, I don't know that they're connected logically. There might be a sort of natural or intuitive connection between, Lutheran Christology and their notion of Christ's presence at the supper, but there's, it's underdetermined. That's not the only route you can take. So yeah, there are dogmatic issues underlying them, but the relation between the two is underdeterminate. You can sort of accommodate and modify things to where you get, and again, the debates still run within Lutheranism about Christology and how that's understood in relation to the presence. And they were different camps. Chemnitz does not look identical to Luther. Neither of them look identical to Andreas, right? There's distinctions within even the Lutheran tradition on how to understand this. So there are dogmatic issues at play, but I don't know that they're as necessarily and logically connected as some might think.
Okay.
We can have our Eucharistic cake without having to also take on the ubiquity icing. There are things you can do.
So we don't need a massive, disputations every, stuff like
Nope,
that.
no one needs that.
Okay.
Not just us. No one needs.
I think it's a very interesting. I think it's a really interesting proposal. Um, I, yeah. I'm going to be, discussing it with the college students and young adults in our parish about. We're going to read portions of Brown's commentary on Article 23, where he kind of gets into all of that. So I'm curious
That's
to
the solution
see.
to all this, by the way. All Anglicans should just read Brown.
Yeah. Well,
That's my. Yeah.
Yes, I'm curious to see that if the draw to objectivity, if that draw can still be maintained, if spiritual does not mean subjective, I'm wondering if that can intellectually satisfy people. That there's just a misunderstanding that spiritual presence, even dynamic receptionism, like the most, I think, what's the word to say? The most thoughtful, not thoughtful, they're all thoughtful, but maybe the most Catholic receptionist kind of expression that the Caroline divines are expressing, that dynamic receptionism. I'm not mistaken. That's what they're holding. There's objectivity in terms of the elements are the mode by which one by faith communes. You're the expert on this, so Claire, please correct me. But I'm wondering if that could soothe, soothe that desire for the objective. Without going the Lutheran direction, I don't know.
I think so, because I think that's one of the reasons young thinking people are coming into traditions like Anglicanism, Eastern Orthodoxy, or in particular Lutheranism, because they're aware that the Kantian turn in epistemology towards the subject and the subjective has been on the whole bad. This has gotten us in a messy place as a civilization. So some of these folks are rightly wary about the subjective and about things being merely subjective. And the Lutherans have a very straightforward answer to this. I think the Reformed view actually does have an answer to it, but it requires a tremendous amount of nuance and subtlety and reasoning and using metaphysical categories carefully.
Sure.
So, like I said before, I take the Reformed view. I think it's the stronger view for any number of reasons. But it also requires a tremendous amount of explanation and catechesis.
Yep.
In terms of, again, what I said at the front, putting our best foot forward in a way that's effective at meeting the culture and the people who are, interested in our tradition. Maybe a more simplified, real, objective, substantial presence in with none of the forms of bread and wine might not be the way to go, at least as a public face, right? And as the leading option. But then for those, well, actually, if you're, now that you've been an Anglican for 4 years and you're pretty comfortable here, let's talk about the 17th century and what the Caroline divines thought, and then you can wrangle with that.
I think that's really helpful. While I have a dogmatician on, I just on this topic.
Yeah.
If I have any Anglo-Catholic listeners for this episode, I hear all the time that the Reformed view is Nestorian. Can you just, as briefly as possible, or not briefly as possible, but can you address that? Like, why is it not Nestorian?
Well, this wasn't just Anglo-Catholics. I mean, within the Reformation itself, the Reformed would accuse the Lutherans of Eutychianism, which Eutychianism, whether that's the doctrine of Eutyches himself or no, matter indifferent, but Eutychianism is this Christological doctrine that the divinity of Christ, the second person of the Trinity of the Word, and the humanity of Christ, those two natures commingle into some third nature, some third thing, not fully divine nor fully human, but both, whatever that might look like. So by teaching that Christ's human body is somehow present in multiple places at once, which seems to be to attribute to Jesus' humanity to the quality or attribute of omnipresence. That's sort of a divine and human thing that's happening there. Like it's Eutychian. On the other hand, the Lutherans and Anglicanism today, Roman or Anglo-Catholics, will often look at The Reformed would say you're being Nestorian. You are not adequately permitting the divine to interpenetrate and transfigure the human so that it can do this thing in the Eucharist. That was the charge. And there are interesting things that have happened since then, right? With quantum mechanics, are the way we think about bodies and their locatability and the singular, they're being multi-locatable. As some interesting implications for these sorts of discussions. So the landscape's changed a bit, but that was how that worked out Christologically at the time. The Reformed Nestorians did not adequately account for the communicatio idiomatum, the transference of divine properties to the humanity of Jesus, which would, according to the Lutheran critique, allow them to make sense of and account for Christ being, substantially present in all the altars every Sunday, at the same time.
Yeah, great. You talk about soteriology. You talk about soteriology, and then we'll briefly mention I think that's just the easiest one to talk about is the ceremony. But soteriology, I think this one's interesting. So, what would be the center of Anglican soteriology? Obviously, there's at this point in the tradition you have Wesleyan strand, you have kind of the central church like corporate election, but kind of allergic to individual election that like light Calvinism or quasi Arminianism of the Caroline Divines. And you have like the strong Reform monergism in the beginning. What would be the center soteriologically?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So in the article itself, I was writing more about soteriology and its implications for theological anthropology. So I was thinking more along the lines of, the Reformed, so Davenant, Usher, Beveridge, John Pearson, their sort of lower anthropology that emphasizes the role of the intellect in determining the election of the will, as opposed to the more voluntaristic accounts of conversion and salvation that you get in someone like, let's say, John Bromhall or other of the Caroline Divines, who are following, we say Arminian, but actually the Caroline Divines and Laudians were following more closely the Lutheran Orthodox. And even the Puritans knew this, but they're slandering the Laudians with Lutheranism wasn't working very well because those were the first reformers. So they switched to Arminians. But yeah, the doctrines vary somewhat. So there's I'm sorry, I completely lost track of where I was going with that. What was the initial question?
Well, you mentioned how, I think you mentioned in your article how, Anglicanism has that, you were talking about anthropology.
Yeah.
But then with that, it has there's accounts of the atonement with that. That might have the most, that is maybe putting our best foot forward, that does the most for Anglicanism. Yeah. So just expanding on the atonement and how that ties to the anthropology you're discussing.
Yeah, so I was kind of leading with anthropology. So like a sort of a lower anthropology that's more intellectualist than voluntarist, because right now our culture is just racked with the worst possible, voluntaristic, ideas you can get, that the raw human will is determinative even for our biology, those sorts of things. So anything you can do to counter that, and the lower intellectualist anthropologies that are really closer to Aquinas than anybody, of Davenant, Usher, Beveridge, and those guys, I think would be really helpful for countering that. But in concert with that, soteriologies that are maybe more softly deterministic, in our accounts of predestination, or that might really emphasize grace over human cooperation, would probably complement this well, right? We're not worried, and we're not worried about de-emphasizing the human element. Right now, the human will is sovereign in the culture of the West, right? So I don't think we're at risk of overemphasizing that. So let's push back against that and emphasize the divine side of the event and or process of conversion, justification, sanctification, all that. So I think So rather than pointing out this school of thought on soteriology should be our center, I guess I just point out a general emphasis. We need to emphasize the God side of justification, of sanctification, of our soteriological models,
Yeah.
and remind the West that the human will is not sovereign. God is.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that's it. So I have more general
Sure.
advice for that rather than like this. This is the system
Specific.
we're putting forward.
Sure. Well, I kind of thank you so much for kind of working through that procedurally and getting to your proposal. I think it's really interesting, and I hope that listeners who care, who have reached the point that they desire an Anglican Theological Center and want to work towards that end, that they keep in mind kind of the guardrails that you provide or the path that you recommend to chart. I guess for those listening, okay, like this is a grand vision, a hypothetical situation,
Yeah.
sure. But on the ground, how can, for clergy or laity listening, how can we begin moving toward a vision of a theological center? What can I, as an individual, do in my own formation for something toward this end?
Oh, well, that's easy. You should purchase my books, which are easily accessible. Shameless marketing. No, I'm only kidding. So probably the way for you to do that, and for other other interested in Anglicans in doing this, point people to the great figures of the tradition. Everyone is talking about classic Anglicanism. No one's really reading classic Anglicanism. Look at the great figures of the tradition. So on the more Reformed, and I mentioned, John Davenant, James Ussher, William Beveridge, John Pearson, John Edwards, not to be confused with Jonathan Edwards, great systematician from around the same time period. And of course, the Caroline Divines, John Bromhall, Peter Halen, William Forbes, Henry Hammond. Read the greats. Just delve into the primary text, and you'll get a sense of this classic Anglican direction. Right? It's not going to be all shared doctrinal propositions that are formally laid out that they all agree upon, but there's a shared direction. You'll get a sense of it. I think that's going to help you when people are talking about a center, have an idea of what the available options are, what's sort of out there. I also would recommend just good catechesis at the parish level.
Yeah.
And sort of introducing them to the breadth of the tradition, and that here's the resources you have to draw from. Here's the challenges you face in the modern world. Here's probably where you want to focus in drawing from those resources.
Yeah.
So guiding people in their reading and their study and their reflection, good catechesis. A lot of what a good professor does is keep telling people what not to read, because you can waste a lot of time.
Yeah.
So keeping people away from nonsense is useful.
Yeah.
Don't go reading don't go read the Left Behind series. Like
Sure.
read something
Sure.
like that.
And for someone who might be disgruntled, maybe they've come to a conviction and they're attending a parish that maybe reflects a different strand of Anglicanism. What would your encouragement be for them? I guess, do they, I think so many people are like, I want to leave, I don't want to be here anymore, or I can't take this. What role is being a good churchman in all of this?
I think probably my first advice would, I don't know, stop being a tool. If there's grace there, if the people at your parish are abounding in the love of Christ, and they're worshiping, and there's just grace present there, tolerate them not having enough candles. Deal with them not having the exact vestments you would wear or prefer. There's biblical precedent for this, right? When Paul confronts Peter and John, the pillars of the church, and he's justifying his ministry to the Gentiles. The way they handle this, they perceived the grace that had been given Paul, and they say, okay, this is a divine ordination. This is his ministry. Have at it. I think we should be doing the same things. The colors might not be your favorite. I go to a church that's not my churchmanship currently. I'm attending right now. I'm not doing parish ministry at the moment, and it's a church that's sort of well lower on the candle than I am, and I love it. because the priest is a godly man with a good heart. The people there are warm and welcoming, um, and Christ is being glorified there and worshipped in word and sacrament. Not in the exact way I do it, but he's being worshipped there. Just my advice would be keep the main thing the main thing. If there's grace there, there's grace there, and just the little minutia that you might not like. It's just that, it's little minutia.
Yep. Thank you. I think that's very helpful. I hope people heed that call, and you can read the sources while you attend a church that doesn't fit, exactly. You can still pursue this while not being potentially a grumpy person. So thank you for that. Dr. Snyder, thank you so much for taking the time for this interview. Yeah. Thank you for writing that piece for the North American Anglican. I hope you continue to write stuff for them, and because you have a valuable voice, I think, for the greater Anglican world. So thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. It was great to be here. I appreciate the invite.
Absolutely.